I'm Allison Mortland with Realizeit, and our presenters today are Professor of Curriculum and Instruction, Matt Vick, and Director of Learning Technology, Nicole Weber, both of the University of Wisconsin at Whitewater. Today's presentation will run 45 minutes, and we will have time for Q&A afterward. The session will be recorded and shared with you after, so you can review it later or pass it on to your colleagues. We do encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. You can do that by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom or using the chat window. So ask your questions throughout, but what we're going to do is hold off on answering them until the end. With all that housekeeping out of the way, I'm excited to get started. I'm going to hand it off right now to Dr. Vick. Thanks for joining us today, Matt.
Thank you very much. So there's Nicole and myself. So we both like to say welcome to everybody from snowy Wisconsin. So our session goals today, we've got four. We'll give a quick overview of adaptive learning, and then we're going to look at the pilot course that the Learning Technology Center at UW-Whitewater worked with me to deploy and kind of evaluate in the pilot stage last summer and fall, and it's ongoing this spring actually. We'll let you know about some of the challenges that emerged and some of the collaborative strategies that we found to be helpful as we went around doing that. We'll start off with the features of adaptive learning.
All right, hi everyone. Like Matt said, greetings from snowy Wisconsin. We're very excited to see yet more snow here. I don't think we believe much in the groundhog anymore, but if you want to throw in the chat where you're from so we can commiserate, that'd be great. So what we thought we would do just before Matt jumps in to talk about how he designed his first adaptive course, we thought it's important to kind of set the stage regarding what adaptive learning actually is. So to do this, what you're seeing now on the screen is I pulled the What Is It section from the 2017 EDUCAUSE Learning Initiative, ELI, 7 Things You Should Know About Feature and Adaptive Learning. So whether you're a learning designer or a faculty member, I can't rave enough about and recommend the EDUCAUSE resources like this series, the Horizon Report, and the Key Issues in Teaching and Learning, as they really help provide perspective on what we're seeing in higher education technology, and how these emerging technologies can contribute to student success and academic transformation, which is something I think that we're all kind of looking toward. All right, so what is adaptive learning? Adaptive learning is one technique for providing personalized learning. Sometimes folks use the two terms personalized and adaptive interchangeably, but they're not necessarily always the same, as there are many other ways and tools you can leverage to personalize a course to a student's needs, right? So adaptive learning is one way to personalize learning for students so that they can have a customized learning path that kind of meets them where they are. And to do this effectively, adaptive learning systems use data to guide pathway development, instruction, and remediation. These pathways can really dynamically adjust based on how a student interacts with the materials and performs on assessments, giving them what they need when they need it so they can progress in the course. Adaptive learning systems can also leverage things like machine learning and artificial intelligence to make instructors' lives a whole bunch easier in finding content so they can spend more time interacting with students. And as the slide shows here, some of the main features of adaptive learning include self-directed learning pathways that have self-paced milestones that show content mastery in a way that accounts for prerequisite knowledge that a student may have through continuous assessments where they have a learning path that can change based on their needs. So why is this exciting and what is the potential for adaptive learning? So I'm really excited about it because I think it comes with the ability to have a really dynamic content system that changes and shifts to meet students where they are. Adaptive learning also has the potential to shift the instructor focus off of content dispersal, so just going into class and disseminating content, to really leading to a lot of time to interact with students in deeper learning activities where students work on really applying what they learned. All right, so now that's kind of the basics of adaptive learning. So now what we're going to do is turn things over to Matt to talk about his pilot course.
Thanks. And before we get directly into the pilot course, just to set the stage, as we looked at how to design and pilot a course, I really had to relook at how I structured the curriculum and instruction. That fits well since that's my own area of scholarship and what I teach for future teachers. But the concept of backward design was especially important is some of those things that Nicole pointed out. Students are able to map their own pathways through the content, and often it's not the pathways that the instructor would have predicted or thought about. So it was really essential to kind of use a framework like backward design to look at what are the big skills and ideas that they need to do, instead of thinking that they're going to come in contact with every nugget of information in the course that I plan, like a traditional lecture-based course where they'd physically be there and supposedly be exposed to the content one way or another as they're going through. Because as we take account of their prior knowledge, they might be skipping parts that they've shown mastery over, but you have to be careful how you structure that, so in skipping that, they're not skipping things that they didn't master. So it was very important to look at those desired results, the assessment plan, the big projects, and this included the things I was not going to try to assess in the course. And I'll talk about that because, within the course and Realize It, because there's about 50% of the course that lived in the adaptive platform. About 50% was still in my asynchronous online space in the summer, and in the fall course where they're actually out in an elementary school teaching some sample lessons that way. And then after all that is when I actually got to planning the instruction in this online way. So kind of adapting it, you come up with these big course objectives, essential questions being a way to get them to inquire about the content and not just looking for it to be told to them. Really working on some good course objectives. Nodes is of discrete little chunks of knowledge that will be showing you some examples of throughout. And that's really where the rethinking when designing an adaptive course comes from. And then we did the content creation. If you just dove into content creation, sometimes you get away with that, but with an adaptive system, it really would have led to a lot of wasted effort. So it was important to go through the process. So my course is Teaching Science in the Elementary Middle School. It's a junior, senior level class for people planning to teach in grades K through 9 in a school setting. They're often not science specialists or even fans of science that way. So the course has a lot of goals in terms of some content knowledge about science, reminding that's not the main goal. That's the gen ed classes they actually take in other science courses, but there's always a little bit of reminder about their content. The major part is the pedagogy of how to teach science and what research says and some of the different ideas out there and looking at things, and then helping them to apply that in lesson plans. Sometimes they get to physically teach the class like they get to do in our spring and fall blended semesters. In the online summer course, they just do an extensive unit plan as an alternative to that. So when we're designing the course, I worked with the instructional designer at the Learning Technology Center to really rethink through stuff. And it was easy for me to be arrogant as a professor of curriculum instruction, thinking I didn't need to consult with an instructional designer, that I really know how to design curriculum. But the back and forth was really productive as it helped me hone in. Remember, students are going to have different pathways through a course. Once you set this up and get it going, you need to clearly think about what really are these essential ideas in the course. You can kind of see some of the examples there, the top one being 3 strands that come from the National Next Generation Science Standards. And then the second big idea there was really from the textbook that I use in the course, and conceptual change models are some ways of teaching science that work on the misconceptions that we all hold that are really tough to change in science, if I can summarize my course in a nutshell. And then I worked through to come up with some essential questions. And this really helped me as an instructor think through from an inquiry perspective, which is what a science methods course is about with teaching with inquiry, how to engage my students in answering these questions and discovering answers themselves here. Some of this fit well into what we're doing in Realize It. Other parts of the essential question required me to do some higher level skills, application, evaluation, and such outside of Realize It, which we did in the D2L framework for the fully online class. And then in the blended semesters, some of it's on D2L, some of it is in face-to-face classes that are held on site in local elementary schools. And then we came up with some course objectives. And I know often that seems like an academic exercise if you're planning something, but once again, just to emphasize, it was really important to structure how this course was going to break things apart, really down into little pieces, and then it builds up in a lot of personalized different ways. And you can kind of see the objectives there that I worked on. And then it was time to do the part that felt like the adaptive part that I saw at the Online Learning Consortium originally when some sessions on Realize It were presented. I got to delve into the system and thinking about these chunks. And like I said earlier, the term is nodes. So you're really rethinking what's the smallest packet of learning that you should structure throughout your course. And to give some content for my 3-credit class, there ended up being 49, 50 chunks of learning that were developed and then had to be structured into a hierarchy that we'll get to in a little bit. And they really built around the idea of conceptual change theory, which is that major research base of how people learn science and have trouble learning science. Understanding by design, we actually use backward design to learn about backward design. Safety, important in any science course. And then there's elements of the next generation science standards. And these 4 themes actually are kind of invisible to students. They're there, but that's where I really learned the structure that seems so transparent in a traditional course syllabus becomes not untransparent, but much more personalized when you're looking at an adaptive course.
And just to chime in a little bit, I think listening to Matt, it strikes me just how important understanding, your course as you're designing it is really. I think instructors who have done backwards design or kind of extensive mapping of where their learning objectives find their evidence and are supported through content will have a much easier time designing their course in an adaptive platform. I think this is really due to, them having then that intricate knowledge of how everything connects. Relatedly, I think it's also important to have the right support in place with the vendor and the campus. As Matt talked about, he worked with an instructional designer. Vendors can also be really, Realizeit, be really integral, beginning training opportunities and things like that. But I also just wanted to point out too that, it does take time. It's a course redesign when you implement adaptive learning. So the time, it shouldn't be underestimated. I liken it a lot too if you're transitioning from kind of a face-to-face course to kind of an online design instead. It does take time and a lot of planning.
All right, so we'll actually let you see kind of what this looked like in the system. So this is just kind of a summary. These were actually chapters from the textbook, and on campus, this was a physical textbook that I actually had the students pick up at our textbook rental, and then supplemented with some other sources as well, but just you'll see some of these terms. This comes from the standards, which are public documents, and you can see there's already kind of a hierarchy built in as I pulled there, and that was helpful to me as an instructor when some of that is already developed for you, and then you kind of piece it apart. So Realizeit can upload from a Word template, and we really looked at some of the text, the video, and then the assessment questions that were created in these templates that were uploaded, which really was the best solution we found when we were doing this. You could also create it in the system, but there are so many different ways to configure, which is very empowering, but can be overwhelming as you're starting a course, especially a pilot course. So we really found it helpful to stick with those Word templates. So just kind of giving you a feel of where my source came from. So the hard copy textbook there is a small run from the National Science Teachers Association. So they just bought the physical textbook. There's no ebook or thing like that available. They got that at our textbook rental. I used a public document from the National Academies. That's the Next Generation Science Standards and the related framework of K-12 science education. And then there were some high quality videos publicly available and promoted as such on the NGSS that were available, which were very important. There was a lot of nodes from the NGSS, and if I had to create all that content myself, it would have taken a lot more time. And also, these are well done, so to recreate that isn't necessarily the best thought in my mind, especially talking with our instructional designer on that as well. So we did a mix of those type of things, and there's a lot of other sources you could definitely bring in as well. And this is just an example of the template, a snapshot from the Word document. So there's a bunch of macros that you use. So the section intro there, that codes in a specific way, and then I entered some text that way. And one of the partnerships with the LTC was definitely that there was a student worker over the summer available to help with this.
Yeah, and just to emphasize Matt's point, I think one of the important things is to make sure that for you Learning Technology Center type folks out in the audience is just to give instructors the support they need to be successful. Sometimes getting this content up in there in the different ways that Matt has described it can be a little bit laborious. And Matt did a lot of these things himself, but we also did hire a student worker to help us explore adaptive learning a little bit and some different tools that we were using. And, you know, I can't say enough about how wonderful it was to work with our student worker. He was really quick to pick up the system and work with Matt to get his information there. Like I said, Matt did a lot of it himself, but our student worker, Jacob, helped a lot with it too. Also, as kind of a thing we weren't really thinking about, we were just looking for help from Matt, but a bigger help, I almost think, for Matt was not just getting the content in there, but it was kind of a student perspective and how he saw the pathways through his lens. So I think, you know, getting that perspective was really useful. We used it a lot in even configuring on our side from the Learning Technology Center, his perspective into how it would look in the learning management system, whether it would pop out or whether it would be part of the, you know, the page itself. And, you know, students have just such a valuable perspective, and bringing them apart as part of your team is really important. And, you know, trying to figure out how to provide these supports to both your unit and to instructors.
And just to point out, our student worker was an accountant student. So we didn't necessarily have a teacher or somebody that would know this content, and that perspective actually was very useful. We told him to go in with the mindset of he was auditing the system I gave, and it seemed to work well. But joking aside, it did really work well for that external eye, not too familiar with the content, to look through, and he did catch a lot of little things that way. This is what that page that I just showed you looks like in Realizeit, and it does integrate into the LMS, so D2 all over the summer, and Canvas now as we've moved to that. So students see this in the LMS that they're used to working in. Another just template, so you enter a source video, some alternate text. We didn't get there with the pilot, but a transcript could be loaded, which would definitely be a best practice we'd work towards that way. Just didn't get to it yet. And then this is, again, you would see that embedded YouTube video there on the bottom, or we pulled videos from on-campus sources as well. And then the assessment was really a spot that took a lot of thinking, because it's an adaptive system. So students don't all see the same questions, and you actually want a big bank of random questions to pull from so that it gets personalized feedback, and the machine learning algorithms work to predict what type of question they should get next and which nodes they should go onto. So this is really what took a lot of time to do well. You could definitely ingest things from question banks. I didn't have that with kind of the resources I used for science teaching class. I had to develop a lot of this. Now, one of the nice options that came with Realizeit, so a multiple choice question, you can see here, I actually fed in 4 correct answers and 3 incorrect. And then our student worker would configure the system, just give them 1 correct, 3 incorrect, and I could have had like 7 incorrects there. So you can get a lot of permutations from just one question asked a lot of different ways, which kind of avoids that gaming of just memorizing the one question that keeps coming back over and over again that way. So that was a really nice, powerful feature that saved me from writing, instead of 20 questions, you could get almost the same amount just from one question with lots of different possible combinations of correct and incorrect. And just to put it in context, the assessment I was looking at in Realizeit was at that base knowledge, that understanding, maybe a little analysis or application, but it was really that core knowledge, half my course. Higher level thinking wasn't being replaced with this. That existed outside of Realizeit in the regular D2L shell or in the blended space in the classroom again. And this is just an example of that question. Students would get a bubble here, and you can see that it keeps track of how many they answer correctly. It asks up to 8, and then we configured how many, if they answered correctly, it would consider them as being good enough to open up future levels. So there was a lot of play at that point as we've gone through of setting what those levels should be. And so some of that just comes down to professional judgment as we started. And it was very helpful having that student worker to configure that for all these nodes versus the instructor myself needing to micromanage that detail. Although I did go back and kind of look at that and gave him some general guidance of, you know, if I have this many questions, set it to ask half of them and things like that. But it was nice to be able to automate that. And then This is the authoring tool directly in Realizeit. And this is just a brief snapshot. You can see on the sides there, edit question form. All of those are things that you can personalize. So it can get overwhelming in a quick hurry if you want to add a lot of that in. But for those of you asking quantitative questions, mathematical, there's formula generators that, similar to the question bank, you'd be able to create a formula so that there'd be almost an endless supply of questions if they're answering something with mathematical answers that way, and you don't have to program in with specific numbers. So we got all that in there. Then we had to start creating some pathways that the students would be guided through, but then again, they would probably discover some of their own pathways that way. They're structured and Realizeit through prerequisite knowledge, and without getting too detailed in there, it's not just a sequence that a teacher is used to going, here's week 1, week 2, week 3, and those are prerequisites because it will build on each other. That's kind of there, but it actually is like a forward-looking prerequisite. So if I do well at something, does it predict my success at something else? Because that's what the algorithms are going to work on. And we did spend a lot of time with the instructional designer to think through what that meant, because if we turn that on too much, there could be unexpected consequences. And that was some of the good guidance from our instructional designer, but also from Realizeit's consultants as well, making sure that we really clearly thought about these pathways so that we weren't overly making something linear that didn't need to be, and also wasn't going to set the system up to make inferences that wouldn't make sense. Because this is the key to how does the system infer that they've mastered something? Can they skip something? Should they repeat something earlier, even if it's been a while since they did it, but because of the way that they answered this later modules questions, it shows that they actually need to go back and relearn or at least refresh on something else. So this hierarchy here shows, these are those titles from the textbook there. So this is the designer view or the instructor view of how I started creating these things and how they're nested. This really isn't how the students are going to interact with the system. We had to make a map of the content chunks. You can start seeing all the nodes that became available at this point, and the color codes kind of were just using different milestones and benchmarks that we won't dive into too much here that map into how students were assigned to complete these different tests. Now, a lot of the structure I gave it didn't necessarily have prerequisites here, but I wanted to give them a flow so that they didn't feel lost if we just gave them 50 possible places to start with. And you can see the little pen icons. There's a lot of customization you can do at each level with their, and that'd be a more advanced look at what you're doing with Realizeit. But it's exciting just as somebody looking at the system. I always find that interesting to see all the different ways to be able to configure things like that. And here's just a little closer up module hierarchy view of how students are going to be guided through some of this content. So we had to create course objectives, and that went back to the backward design. So mapping that into how Realizeit does it, it had to become an objective tied to a series of nodes that were grouped together. And then there was actually a grade that would be shipped back to the learning management system. And there's a variety of ways to set that up. We don't have to get into the details, but it's kind of a combination of how much content are they exposed to, and also taking into what their mastery level is with that. So with this course, ended up coming with these objectives. So understanding by design kind of stood alone, then conceptual change theory, the textbook sat as a nice package of objectives. And then those other things are things from the next generation science standards naturally. And I wanted to make these objectives also flow in terms of having a due date, because that was important as I sequenced assignments they'd have that weren't part of Realizeit, that were outside the adaptive system, where they were writing, for me, it happened to be lesson plans and doing some discussion boards with me. So student logs in. They're going to see here, this is a sample. When I logged in as a student here, I'd looked at 18 of the 49 different nodes. So it kind of gives you that real-time feel of how much of the course I've completed, gives me some analytics of the time I've spent in there, the estimate of how long I have left to do all the online learning in the course, showing me kind of the level that I'm at. I can start a module, list them there. So they are guided what they should do next, but actually they're able to choose and do other things. If they're struggling with a certain area and it's okay, and you've structured it that way, they could actually branch out and try something else. And this is just another view of there. So once they click on the foundations of conceptual change, they get a breakdown of these things. Again, notice it's estimating about 20 minutes left there. You can see the learning map. If they hover, they'll see more details of the names there. Alternate steps given, different ways to look at doing the module. You can go back and be quizzed again on a different random set of the questions. Now I'm at the mastery level for the sample, so I wouldn't necessarily need to do that unless I just wanted some practice. But if it indicated I was not at that level, that would let me go back and try that again. And then one more time as they look at the module test, just want to point out at the bottom here, determine knowledge. That's actually, you can think of it as an adaptive pretest, which was an important component to let them do because that really lets students come in and skip over things they know. So it's not a science content course, but we kind of think there's some basic things that an elementary science teacher should know that we don't mind checking again when I design the course. So the Earth is a planet. It's the third one from the sun. Maybe not the most vital knowledge, but we kind of think maybe a third grade or fourth grade teacher should know that. So there's some base level things there that were included in some of the content areas and determine knowledge. And if they passed it all, yeah, they learned enough in their own elementary, middle school science that they don't need to watch a video on that again. But if they did not, they were going to be guided to watch that video and try to reassess themselves. And that really, that allowed, with the adaptive framework here, me to put some of that base level stuff from the science of content knowledge in here, not to change what my course is about, but it's kind of the prerequisites that are assumed that they bring from their content knowledge background. And the science literature would say they've got misconceptions that get in the way. So I acknowledge that, but this is a way to try to get them to circle back of some of those basic facts of knowledge. And it was just the facts level, and look at that. Interestingly, and we'll talk a little later, a lot of the students didn't use determined knowledge. About half of them didn't. They just plowed through and watched the videos and did the tasks. Not fully certain, anecdotally, some of them just were so ingrained in the mindset of doing everything. So it was kind of an interesting case study there, but we'll talk more about that at the end. So this just kind of summarizes what I was talking about with determined knowledge, but realize that's the key to designing that personalized pathway when they take advantage of determined knowledge. Even if they don't, though, they're still going to end up with a personalized pathway because they're going to make their way through these different nodes in different ways than their colleagues based on, the amount of right answers that they're giving. So this then would be the instructor view of student progress. I've blued out the names of my 14 students from the summer pilot on the side there, but I'm just scanning and you can see the different colors there. So yellow, they have not mastered. They've only gotten about 77% of the content correct versus in the understanding by design, they had 96% correct for that top student there. And on the top, those bar graphs are kind of showing the difference between the knowledge state and the knowledge covered. Covered, did they click on it? Did they see the video? Versus have they tested out of the knowledge, or have they shown that knowledge on the assessment that way? So this was a useful dashboard for me as an instructor. And this is just kind of a more expansive view of the different types of things I was able to look at. And then there's internal ways in the system that you're able to give feedback to students within Realizeit, saying, do you need help on this? Have you tried this? Are you keeping up on this? I could obviously do that in other external ways as well with email or things through the LMS, but it tracked all those interactions and you could get some analytics out of it later.
Yeah, and just to, emphasize kind of what Matt's saying, what I really like about adaptive learning platforms like this is that they really give you a lot of information, but in digestible ways, which is really helpful from the instructor perspective, as Matt was sharing, just because it's incredibly important to be able to quickly understand how your students are doing and be able to quickly do that, which helps you really figure out when and how to intervene effectively.
So now we're going to kind of look at the challenges and successes that we felt we've observed through our pilot. Again, we did one online course in the summer, and then we did blended learning modules, 3 of them in the fall semester, and that actually was through adjuncts. I had some other duties, so I worked with them, and it was very interesting to hear their feedback of the system, which was very positive as well. And then we're continuing with that this spring as well and gathering some more data and continually refining things. So I hinted at this already, but one of the challenges directly at the beginning was really taking a careful consideration of what a prerequisite was, what adaptive learning was, what these personalized pathways are going to be. I went to OLC, saw the presentations from Central Florida and from Colorado Tech that were using this exact same system that way. So I kind of had that framework coming in as an instructor, had high interest. But it was very interesting as we were going through the training sessions, working with the instructional designer. And even as somebody that works in curriculum instruction, I found myself having to face my own misconceptions about what the system was and to let go. I mean, the whole part of adaptive is to not be as constrictive about that. And it really changed how I design content, put content into those nodes, realizing that students aren't going to necessarily see each piece that I put in the Realizeit platform or the adaptive platform. And that's the point. And to let myself kind of embrace that model. And the things that didn't fit there, I didn't put in Realizeit. I put those outside in our learning management system or in the face-to-face classroom. In dividing the course content into nodes, I don't know, as you're listening to my presentation, if that sounded as complex as it was, but it really was a challenge. It's like, oh, I mean, you might think you have this great textbook that breaks things down into modules and that's done for you. Not really. That might be a nice starting point for some content areas, but you're really going to have to rethink and keep those things fairly succinct. On the other hand, you don't want it so pointed that there's not enough to assess students on, because then there's nothing to infer about their learning from there. So the development of your assessment questions in the system, really, it was kind of a synchronous process with designing the content, because you had to have sufficient assessment to go with that content to make it into a node. So it flowed and changed several times. And then when we packaged those nodes into milestones or course objectives, went back and forth with our consultants with Realizeit a lot too, just making sure they truly made sense to what I was trying to do with the course, looking at the syllabus. Was this matching? They're supposed to learn this knowledge and Realizeit to then apply with some projects that they were doing outside of this system. And it took a lot of thinking and not to rush through, and you're definitely not working a week ahead of your students. This all had to be well thought through before deploying the course. There is the possibility for change once it's deployed, but it's not ideal. And really, as personalized and nonlinear as it is, it's not going to work, even if people survive with that in their, I'd say, traditional online classes that have week structures that maybe you can work that week ahead. This really changed that mindset, and it was exciting, but you need to know the time load that you're looking at going into here.
And I can chime in with just a few, challenges from kind of a learning technology center kind of perspective. From those of you in the audience who are from that kind of vein of your campus. I think a challenge is that adaptive learning is still kind of a new concept for many, and it takes some getting used to, especially how it can be leveraged as part of a new model of teaching, which they have all that dissemination then gets you in exchange for more interaction and active learning time, which is, I think, really great thing to explore. As it's a new concept, I think staff, both learning technology center staff and instructional staff, don't always have the necessarily have the experience with particular tools. So luckily for us, in our situation, our new instructional designer at the time had some experience in his prior position, but even with him, it took time to really grasp how the tool had progressed, because tools do tend to progress over time and get better, of course, with changes. But with other staff, it took a lot of upskilling, especially with both him and other staff. It took upskilling, to get up to date on the tool and be able to support an instructor like Matt. And I think, another challenge is just that, vendors sometimes have different implementation models. So you really have to work with them pretty closely. So some like to do design and work with individual instructors more closely. But this can sometimes have, price implications and work against, campus cultures. So really think about what your campus needs. And it's important to have early conversations with the vendor about how you want to implement the tool and the support you would need for them to do it. And this paves the way for really a successful collaboration, which, I think is a big win for everyone.
So we'll look at some of the student feedback. I mean, nice, short, and simple. It was always good to see a student enjoyed it. Another student just mentioning, how it layered it and they like the system in the field. So it's kind of nice to know that as well. It's always, as a teacher, good to see when students say that it's helping them gain a strong understanding for a concept. Yep, some students definitely felt frustrated, and it was a warning Realizeit gave us when we were designing here, that some are going to fixate on becoming an expert, getting the green star in every module. It's that kind of perfectionism, and definitely working with future K-9 teachers, that is a mindset. Many of them are used to having almost everything at that really good level. So it was, we tried to work with them and manage those expectations, understanding what an adaptive system is and what it means, and they were still doing very well with there, but it was a little different for some of them. And then some, of course, we did have one student over the summer that said they struggled a little bit to navigate. They weren't learning the material, so not all perfect, but overall, it definitely was the vast majority, 75% or more, that highly enjoyed working with the system and said they would like to do an adaptive class in the future. And as future teachers, we actually even asked, would you want to do this if you had the opportunity in a K-9 environment? And they said yes, even though most of them are prepared to do face-to-face classrooms. I think they're realizing that face-to-face and online continue to blend even in the K-12 arena as well. Once again, that own pace, definitely expected to hear feedback about that. So good to see that. That was part of the power, especially in a summer online course where I know students take there and some of them are vacationing, working, family raising, all those things, even more than the traditional semesters for us. It was really a good fit over the summer. And then we found that it's been good in the semesters as well. Interesting to see that repetition helped engrave it in information in the brain. The fact that the earlier modules would maybe go down a color and make them redo there to go up if they had forgotten and failed to show that information with later nodes that were there. And the general picture that's painted. The graphical interface really seemed to give students that feeling for the pathways they were taking, and the color coding gave them enough information to kind of know where they're doing. I mean, some of this kind of blends with that, the ideas of gamification. I mean, I don't think this looks like a video game with points and things like that, but there's some of that you can see with their responses here, that it's helping them know how much have they completed, what have they done, how are they doing that way. So the instructor feedback here is a blend of kind of my own thoughts, but also working with 3 adjuncts in the fall. And I would classify them, I mean, they're all science teaching experts. That's why they were hired to teach this class. 2 were in-service teachers right now. 1 is just a very recently retired science teacher. They all love tinkering and they all love the system overall, and gave some nice qualitative feedback as well. And I should say, for our context, we're used to faculty and academic staff designing and teaching their courses. Our institution does not use a lot of instructional designers. That Nicole mentioned we have 1. Usually that's more of a consultant role. The instructor is the one doing a lot of this. Obviously there's a lot of different models out there in higher education, but just want to point out the lens we're looking at, we don't have a subject matter expert, and then that's delivered by adjuncts. The adjuncts in my case are because I had some administrative duties and they were taking the classes for the fall. I very well will be teaching this class again in the future that way. So I'm very invested in continually looking at there. I loved how this let me use the discussion board in the asynchronous summer space. Fully online class, they're making some in-depth lesson plans, unit plans. I used the discussion board, and my instructor presence was pretty heavy there, but students weren't against that. And it had a conversation, and it wasn't about them, tell me a time and you're teaching when this. There was a little bit of that, but mostly it was looking at the misconceptions teachers have about teaching science from the research, using the readings. And I would come back to earn their full credit. They had to actually show an understanding of what the knowledge base was. It really wasn't opinion-based questions to each other. And I really felt like I had meaningful discussions in a fully online class for future teachers, that many of them are going to teach face-to-face. It just made me feel a lot better about seeing their progress, as a science teacher, understanding how causation and correlation aren't the same thing, and how that actually matters when you're teaching science to little children, because you set up those misconceptions later on, if you don't, that faculty at colleges are dealing with in science and social science courses that way. So it made me really satisfied to see us be able to have higher level discussion board posts outside of Realizeit, because I'd offloaded the knowledge and understanding level into this system, adaptively working through. I worked on the higher level stuff with students and really gave them rich feedback on the unit plans, which are not the easiest things to grade. They're not totally objective, but a lot of back and forth there to let them progress and show a lot of the skills that we're learning about, that research shows us about teaching science. And the interactions I had about the platform or about that basic level content were minimal. And it's not, I'm not trying to sound lazy here, because what it let me do is actually spend more time on higher level things, like I just said. But I wasn't answering, it's on page 53 for this part of the textbook, for those type of questions. There is a way they can flag something they thought was incorrect in the system. Really easy for me as an instructor to check. There was one that was fill in the blank, and yeah, they just had a very different capitalization routine, and that was easy to fix. Other times it's like, nope, actually the right answer was there. You were actually just answering with a very common misconception. So you just proved that again. Sharing that in a nice way with the students.
Yeah, and just to, emphasize, on what Matt's been sharing, that's part of the reason why I just really love adaptive learning, is it gives instructors that ability to really work with students around kind of deeper learning activities. And one thing that we've talked about, Matt and I've talked about quite a bit, is, how, having students in this system interacting with the content and getting the content mastery this way really allowed him the time to go back and forth on assignments where he might not have had the time to go back and forth, like creating lesson plans, which are something that science teachers really need to be able to do and do well. But giving him that time then back to kind of go back and forth so that it can get, deeper and students can learn a lot more. I mean, just think back to your college career. How many times did you turn in an assignment and never get, you got a little feedback, right? How much better would it have been? How much more would you have learned if your instructor would have went around a couple more times with you about that specific assignment that you would learn? But yeah, so we'll move on a little bit, I think, to talk more about kind of more of the Learning Technology Center side and how we collaborate with instructors and have really a support mechanism for this collaboration around emerging learning technologies. So the first slide that you see here is kind of how we enable instructor exploration of tools like this. So I came aboard as the Director of Learning Technology in 2015 here at Whitewater. And even in my interview process, it was really clear that the campus wanted the Learning Technology Center to be more than a help desk of just teaching people how to click the learning management system buttons. And they wanted us to move to be more of a strategic partner on campus. One of the things that I'm most proud of related to this goal is the creation of our Emerging Technology Exploration Program, which enables the LTC and instructors to explore emerging learning technologies like we've been talking about today. So we select projects for the program based on the graphic you see here. We start by understanding the needs of our campus and trends that are happening in higher education. Then we use those trends and needs to select a project or a tool. We move then to kind of recruiting instructors to authentically use the tool in their courses with their students. We think this is really important to see the authentic use. And then we make sure that we have development activities for staff and instructors to get up to speed on the tool and the pedagogical techniques and things like that. And then we actually see the implementation of the tool in courses and evaluate it to make sure that we're meeting the need that we set out to meet and the challenges that we want to help to try to solve. So our first step is always to understand key trends and campus needs. We do this, a couple different ways, and we do our best to stay current, as I'm sure all of you do, in what's happening in higher ed. And we do this through a couple different publications, like I mentioned earlier in our webinar, is things like the Horizon Report and key issues in teaching and learning from our friends at EDUCAUSE. Really are really great things to keep you up to date. A year ago when you can go back a second there, Matt. A year ago when we kind of set out on our journey, we knew from these publications that there was a growing focus on measuring learning, also a growing interest in adaptive learning technologies, and this idea of extending thinking around leveraging technology and pedagogy for academic transformation that was aimed at these breakthrough models of figuring out how to increase student success. While it's always great to understand kind of these national trends through these kinds of publications, it's also important to understand kind of what's going on your own campus. And at the Learning Technology Center, we do this both informally and formally at our campus in various ways. So we have things like our Learning Technology Center advisory group that's comprised of 2 instructors from each of our colleges to give us kind of advice on what they're seeing and challenges that they're seeing in their classrooms and their needs. We also do consultations and meetings with instructors, administrators, and chairs. But one of my favorite things to do every year is to do an annual instructor support survey, which is kind of the picture there in the lower right-hand corner of the slide. And what we do is in this survey, we ask instructors about their interests and their biggest challenges in the classroom, both online and face-to-face. And for the past few years, we found the same sorts of things. So folks are having challenges with student engagement, student motivation, and students like reading material and coming to class prepared. So we kind of mix these all together to form an adaptive learning pilot aimed at increasing student engagement, motivation, and content understanding. So once we knew adaptive learning was where we wanted to go after for our 2018-2019 pilot project, we began reviewing the tools. Just to share a little bit about our time frame, we started looking at tools in December of 2017, which it's really important to have an early review because it allows for time for a fall implementation, which is usually it's a better implementation to get people going in fall because they have the whole summer prior to really get ready and do instructional development and other development, course design things. As we reviewed tools, we brought in various folks for their perspectives, so like our learning management system administrator, our learning technology consultant, instructional designer, instructor, folks like that. And we evaluated the technologies based on a rubric that was comprised of these 6 areas that you kind of see here. So we really wanted tools that were applicable to various disciplines. So we like to broadly explore tools that serve all our colleges and disciplines. We also were interested in making sure that we were rating different vendors based on how well it integrated with our learning management system of our future, which is Canvas. Of course, in higher education, we're always interested in cost and scalability. So we had that on our rubric, as well as depth of resources to assist instructors from the vendor side. And we also got some time with all of the different vendor platforms to kind of take a look to see how easy it would be to support and how easy it would be for instructors to build and students to use. And the final thing is we were also interested in how established the vendor was in the field. So we didn't want somebody that was necessarily going to disappear tomorrow. So after we kind of selected a tool, we go down to kind of the recruitment phase then. So with pilot projects like these, we often do 1 of 2 recruitments. So either a broad recruitment where you put out a call to campus for all instructors to participate and they put in a proposal and then they're ultimately selected or not. We usually choose around 10. Otherwise, if we want to explore something quite new that we're not really that familiar with and that we know someone on campus is really excited about, we do a focused recruitment. For this project, we knew that we had a champion in Matt, and we went just with the focused recruitment to kind of just get a really sneak peek, really early exploration on what adaptive learning would look like here at Whitewater. So instructional development focused really, as Matt shared earlier, on early consultation with our instructional designer to content map and lead the different pathways. During this time, the instructor and staff received training from the vendor regarding their tool, and Matt, the instructional designer, and our LMS support team and learning technology specialists all met frequently for project meetings to all stay on the same page and get ready to kind of launch the work this summer. Matt also took responsibility for a lot of the content creation while working with our instructional designer and student worker to get in there for use in his course. And we also worked with Matt a lot to design evaluation tools to understand the impact and use of the tool, which, Matt showed a little bit of that student qualitative and quantitative feedback a little bit before. So just to wind things down a little bit so we have time for some Q&A, just some final keys that, from our perspective, that lead to success for pilot projects like these, because I know that we have some Learning Technology Center folks and some designers in the crowd. And these are probably good for instructors too, but begin planning early. Don't underestimate how long it takes to redesign a course when you're integrating a new tool, especially a big game changer like adaptive learning that could change a lot of what you do in the classroom inside and out. If you're in a support field, like an instructional designer, be sure to identify your instructional champions. Without instructors actually using the tool in their courses, you'll never know how it can actually work and see its potential. On the flip side, if you're an instructor out there and interested in adaptive learning, be sure to contact units like your Learning Technology Center on your campus. They might want to explore this with you and have different supports that they could offer you. Other than that, just really make sure that there's a support structure in place to make projects like these successful. Instructional designers and learning technology specialists are important for design and integration of common things like the learning management system. I think one thing that I've learned from working with students in all these pilot projects that we do at Whitewater is that they really love the idea of a cohesive experience. So if things like Realizeit and adaptive learning and other tools can be integrated into learning management system to give them a one-stop shop, they prefer that. So make sure to get those things set up with your learning management system folks and collaborators. And then think just what people and what support is needed from the vendor and what other supports like student helpers might be needed to make the project successful. But I think, you know, in the end, just take a deep breath and feel the excitement over trying to figure out and plan for making learning experiences better for your campus students. I know that's what we're really excited about.